The story I'm about to tell made me hesitate for a long time about whether I should talk about it publicly. But after many years of silence, I realized that people need to know the truth about what is hidden in our forests. Today I want to talk about two incidents that occurred 6 years apart but are much more closely connected than they might seem at first glance. The first occurred in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana in the fall of 2005, and the second in Crater Lake National Park in Oregon in the winter of 2011. David Cowley was an experienced hunter. At 52, he had spent more time in the forests of Montana than many people had spent at home. He worked as a railroad mechanic, but he devoted every vacation and every weekend to hunting. He especially loved hunting moose in remote areas where other hunters rarely ventured. On October 22, 2005, David set out for the Bitterroot National Forest, north of the village of Darby. He chose a spot about 40 miles from the nearest road and made his way there on an ATV along old logging trails. The plan was simple: spend 4 days in the woods, find a good spot to lie in wait, and try to take down a large male. The first 2 days went smoothly. David found fresh tracks, set up camp by a small stream, and began to explore the area. The forest in this area is dense, with many old spruce and fir trees, and it's quite dark among the trees even during the day. But he was familiar with places like that, especially during hunting season. On the third day, October 24th, early in the morning, David noticed something strange. Near his camp, about 30 yards from the tent, lay a fallen tree. It definitely wasn't there the night before. It was quite thick, about a foot in diameter, and looked as if it had simply been snapped in half. He stepped closer to take a closer look. The crack was fresh and the wood was light in color, with no signs of rot or insect damage. There were no marks from a saw or an axe, and it looked as if the tree had been broken by hand. He noticed several footprints on the ground, large ones about the size of his palm, but much wider. They looked like human footprints, but were too big and had very long toes. My first thought was that it was a bear. Black bears and grizzlies were common in those parts, and they could easily have snapped a tree like that. But these tracks didn't look like bear tracks or any other tracks he recognized. Besides, I have a question. Why would a bear break a tree right next to a human camp? He decided not to make a big deal out of it and went hunting. David decided to head north, where he had seen fresh moose tracks the day before. He moved slowly, stopping every few minutes to listen and look around. Silence reigned in the forest. All he could hear were his own footsteps, and, occasionally, the sound of the wind rustling through the treetops. Around 10 in the morning, David came out into a small clearing and saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. In the middle of the clearing stood something that he at first mistook for a large, dark boulder, but after a few seconds, he realized it was a living creature. It was standing with its back to him about 80 yards away and was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its entire body was covered in dark, almost black fur. Its head was large, but David couldn't make out its face. The creature had its back to him. His first thought was logical: a bear, but the proportions didn't add up. It was too tall and looked too much like a human. Besides, bears don't usually stand on their hind legs for so long without moving. He slowly raised his rifle, an old, reliable .30-06 Remington 700. It was powerful enough for a moose, and it should be powerful enough for a bear too. He aimed at the center of its back, where its heart was supposed to be, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest. He saw the bullet hit its mark and the creature lurch forward slightly. But instead of falling, it slowly turned toward him. What he saw next still haunts him in his nightmares. The face was almost human, but distorted and feral, with a wide mouth, enormous teeth, and small vicious eyes. On its chest, where a bullet wound should have been, there was a dark spot, but there was almost no blood. The creature looked straight at him and let out a sound. Not a growl, not a howl, but something halfway between a scream and a roar. It was a loud, piercing sound that made David's ears ring. And then it lunged at him. He frantically tried to reload his rifle, but his hands were shaking, and the cartridge fell to the ground. The creature was approaching at an incredible speed, taking huge leaps of 20 to 25 feet each. It was running on 2 legs like a human, but much faster. When it was about 30 feet away from him, David dropped his rifle and ran for his life. For his age, he was in good physical shape, but he knew he wouldn't be able to outrun that creature in the open. His only chance of survival was to make his way to a dense forest and try to hide among the trees. He He darted into the thicket of young fir trees and ran, paying no attention to where he was going, snapping branches and tripping over roots. Behind him, he heard the crack of breaking branches and heavy breathing. The creature was chasing him and, judging by the sounds, was quickly catching up to him. He ran out onto the slope of a small hill, slipped on the wet leaves and tumbled down, hitting a rock and feeling a sharp pain in his left shoulder. Then tried to stand up, but his arm wouldn't obey him. It seemed he had broken his collarbone. He looked around and noticed a crevice in the rock about 10 feet away from him. It was narrow, but deep enough for a person to fit inside. David rushed over and crawled into the crevice just as the creature appeared at the top of the hill. It made its way down much more cautiously than he did and began to look around. It walked back and forth, sniffing the area and making soft sounds, something like a snort or a sniffle. He lay in the crevice, trying not to breathe, and felt sweat running down his face despite the October chill. The creature approached the crevice and stopped. David could see its paws, huge, furry, with long toes and black claws. It stood there for a few minutes, and David was sure it would find him and drag him out of his hiding place, but instead, the creature walked away. He heard it making its way down the slope for another 10 minutes, and then the sounds faded away. He lay in the crevice for another hour, not daring to crawl out. His shoulder hurt unbearably, and he began to fear that he might lose consciousness from the pain. By the time he finally emerged from his hiding place, the sun was already setting, and he had to make his way cautiously back to where he had left his rifle. But he didn't find her there. Instead, there were large bare paw prints on the ground and dark spots that looked like blood. It became clear that he needed to get to the camp as quickly as possible before it got dark. He had to take a detour, trying to avoid the thick underbrush where the creature might be lurking. His arm hurt so badly that he had to stop several times to keep from passing out. He reached the camp after it had already grown completely dark, and the first thing he saw was that his tent had been torn to shreds. His belongings were scattered all over the clearing, and his ATV wasn't where he had left it. As he got closer, David noticed that there was a fist-sized hole in the gas tank, and that all the gas had leaked onto the ground. He realized that staying at the camp for the night meant certain death, since the creature clearly knew where he was and could return at any moment. His only option was to try to make his way to the road on foot, despite his broken shoulder in the darkness. So he gathered the essentials, a flashlight, some food, and a first aid kit, and set off. He had to walk along the same logging trail he had ridden down on his ATV. In the dark, it was barely visible among the trees, and David lost his way several times. After walking for about an hour, he heard a familiar sound behind him, the crackling of breaking branches, and stopped to listen. The sounds were getting closer and closer. Something large was moving through the woods parallel to the trail, staying about 100 yards away from him. David quickened his pace, trying not to let his fear show, but the sounds behind him also grew louder. The creature was clearly following him, but for some reason it didn't attack. Perhaps it was waiting for the right moment. When he was about 2 miles from the road, he came out onto a small clearing and saw a silhouette ahead, tall, dark, standing right on the trail. The creature was waiting for him. David slowly backed away and turned off the trail into the woods. Walking through the thick underbrush with a dislocated shoulder was painful, but he had no choice. He made his way through the trees, trying to move as quietly as possible, hoping to avoid an ambush, but after half an hour, he realized he was lost. In the darkness, all the trees looked the same, and he could no longer make out the trail. He stopped near a large fir tree and tried to get his bearings by the stars, but the sky was overcast, and just then he heard someone breathing. Heavy, slow, right nearby. David froze and slowly turned his head. 10 feet away, behind the trunk of a nearby tree, he made out the edge of a hairy shoulder. The creature stood motionless, and he realized that it had noticed him too. For a few seconds, they simply stood there, not moving, and then the creature slowly stepped out from behind the tree. Now David could see it clearly. It was enormous, covered in dark fur, with long arms and a massive torso. There was a dark spot on its chest, the mark left by his shot. The wound was shallow. The bullet had only grazed the skin, and the creature's eyes reflected the light of the flashlight, just like an animal's, but they revealed a human mind. It raised its right hand and showed David his own rifle. David realized this was a show of force. The message was, "I've taken your weapon, now you're defenseless." Then the creature threw the rifle at his feet. The metal clanged against the stone. David looked down and saw that the stock had split in half and the barrel was bent. The rifle was completely destroyed. When he looked up, the creature was gone. It had vanished as silently as it had appeared. David waited a few minutes, made sure no one was around, and continued on his way. Now he was walking faster, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. His only desire was to reach civilization as soon as possible. He came out onto the road around 4 in the morning. The asphalt strip of Highway 38 seemed to him to be the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He walked to the nearest village and knocked on the door of the first house where he saw a light on. The homeowner, an elderly farmer named Bill McGregor, found him on the porch in a semi-conscious state, called an ambulance, and he was taken to a hospital in Hamilton. There, the doctors confirmed that he had a broken collarbone and put him in a cast. When the sheriff arrived to take his statement about the incident, David said that a bear had attacked him, that he got scared and ran, fell, and broke his shoulder. The ATV broke down on its own. It was an old machine and things like that happen, but he never said a word about the creature. This story is about Mike Thornton, who has been working as a ranger at Crater Lake National Park for 12 years. At 37, he was considered one of the park's most experienced employees. He knew every trail, every lookout point, and every spot where tourists might get into trouble. The winter of 2011 was particularly snowy. Most of the park's roads were closed to visitors, but the rangers continued to patrol the area, monitoring the condition of the buildings and equipment. Mike often worked the night shift, and on February 7th, he was tasked with checking on the condition of several remote campgrounds in the southern part of the park. The recent snowfalls might have damaged the roofs of buildings or blocked emergency exits. This was a standard procedure he had carried out hundreds of times. He left the park headquarters around 8 p.m. in a park-issued pickup truck. The plan was to visit 5 campgrounds, check the condition of the buildings, take photos for the report, and return by midnight. Everything went smoothly at the first 3 campsites. There was a lot of snow, but the roofs held up and the doors and windows remained intact. Mike made the necessary notes and headed for the 4th stop, the Lost Creek Campground, located about 8 miles from the main road. The road to the campground wound through a dense forest of Douglas fir and mountain hemlock. It was narrow and winding, and almost no one drove on it in the winter. There was a thick layer of snow on the ground, and even with all-wheel drive, the pickup skidded a few times on the steep inclines. Around 10 p.m., about halfway to the campground, he heard a strange sound. At first, it sounded to him like the wind rustling through the treetops, but then he realized it was the crackling of branches snapping. The sound was loud and rhythmic, as if something enormous were making its way through the woods alongside the road. Mike slowed down and rolled down the window so he could hear better. The sounds grew clearer. Something large was clearly moving among the trees. Most likely a moose or a deer, he thought, although it was strange that the animal was moving so close to the road and making so much noise. After driving another half-mile, the sounds died down, and he decided to ignore them and continued on his way to the campground. But a few minutes later, an obstacle appeared ahead on the road. A huge tree was lying across the road. It was a fir tree 60 feet tall and about 3 feet in diameter. Judging by its green needles and clean break, it had fallen very recently. Mike pulled the pickup over and got out to look around. The tree had undoubtedly fallen very recently. The snow beneath it hadn't yet packed down. It remained a mystery to me what had caused it to fall. There was practically no wind, and the snow load did not appear to be critical. Moreover, the tree was healthy, with no signs of disease or damage. Mike walked around the tree trunk and noticed something strange. There were tracks in the snow around the tree, large, resembling human footprints, but much wider and with very long toes. They led from the tree into the woods, but disappeared into the thick underbrush after a few yards. Mike took out a flashlight and examined the base of the tree. The bark had been stripped off at a height of about 8 feet above the ground, not evenly, but in strips, as if something very powerful had grabbed the trunk with its hands and shaken it, but there was no logic to it. He had never seen a tree of that size felled by hand. Even a group of people with ropes and levers would have needed several hours to do it. But here, it looked as if someone had simply walked up to the tree and snapped it in two. When he returned to the pickup truck, he immediately contacted the fleet dispatcher via radio, reported that the road was blocked, and asked them to send a crew with a chainsaw to clear the way. The dispatcher said that the nearest crew wouldn't be able to arrive until morning, which meant he would have to walk to the campground. He grabbed a work flashlight, a camera, and a walkie-talkie from the pickup truck and set off. The distance to the campground was about 2 miles. Not that far, but in the dark and through deep snow, the walk would take at least an hour. It was hard to walk. The snow was knee-deep, and in some places where the wind had blown it up, it was waist-deep. Mike fell into hidden holes and ravines several times. The lantern illuminated only a few yards ahead, and beyond the cone of light, the forest seemed completely black. About half an hour later, he heard a sound that made him stop. It was a deep, low roar, long and powerful, that echoed through the forest. The sound was unlike anything Mike had ever heard before. The roar sounded again, this time closer. He realized the sound was coming from somewhere ahead, from the direction of the campground. He quickened his pace, trying to walk as quietly as possible, while all sorts of possibilities raced through his mind. Maybe it was a bear waking from hibernation, or a pack of wolves cornering their prey. When he was about half a mile from the campground, he saw a light. It was dim, yellowish, and flickering among the trees. At first he thought it was a campfire, but as he got closer, he saw that the light was coming from one of the campground's outbuildings. It was a small shed where tools and equipment were stored. There was clearly someone inside. The light was moving as if someone were walking around with a flashlight. Mike cautiously approached the building and peered through the window. What he saw left him speechless for a few seconds. Standing in the middle of the room was a creature about 9 feet tall, massive and covered in dark fur, with long arms and enormous shoulders. It was holding a large metal toolbox and apparently was examining its contents. The creature turned toward the window and Mike saw its face. Almost human, but coarse and primitive, with a low forehead, prominent brow ridges, a broad nose, and small but intelligent eyes. Their eyes betrayed curiosity, almost childlike wonder at the unfamiliar objects. He slowly backed away from the window, trying not to make a sound, and tried to turn on his radio to call for backup, but a new sound stopped him. It was the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps. The creature had emerged from the building and was now standing at the entrance, looking around. It had clearly picked up on something, a scent or a sound that betrayed the presence of a human. As he tried to sneak around the corner of the building unnoticed, he tripped over a stump and fell. Snow rained down from the nearby branches with a dull thud. The sound wasn't very loud, but in the silence of the night, it sounded like a gunshot. Something spun sharply toward him and let out the same roar Mike had heard earlier, only now it was much louder and closer. The sound made his ears ring and his chest tightened with a primal fear. He jumped to his feet and rushed toward the woods, but the creature was much faster and caught up with him just a few yards from the building, striking him in the back with its enormous paw. The blow was so strong that Mike was sent flying several feet and crashed into the trunk of a large fir tree. He fell face first into the snow, feeling a sharp pain in his back and ribs. He then tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The creature came closer. The smell became even more pungent and animal-like, but with a hint of something human. The creature grabbed him by the jacket and pulled him to his feet. Mike found himself face to face with a creature that shouldn't have existed. The creature's eyes were level with his forehead, and they held a strange expression, something like curiosity. It studied his face for a few seconds, then let him go and took a step back. He stood rooted to the spot, feeling sweat run down his back. The creature walked over to his flashlight, which had fallen into the snow during the chase, picked it up, and turned it on. A bright beam of light illuminated the trees, and the creature let out a sound, something like a surprised grunt, and directed the beam at its hand, then at Mike, and then back at its hand. It was clearly trying to figure out how the device worked. Mike realized he had a chance. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, he took the walkie-talkie out of his pocket and pressed the emergency button. A loud siren pierced the silence of the night. The creature spun around abruptly at the sound, dropping the lantern. The siren continued to wail, and its echo reverberated through the trees. It covered its ears with its paws and began to retreat, making sounds like a pained growl. Mike took advantage of the commotion and rushed to his pickup truck. The siren continued to wail, and he could hear noises behind him. The creature was clearly trying to get rid of the source of the noise. There were loud thuds, cracks, and bangs. It seemed as if, in a fit of rage or pain, it was smashing everything around it. Running through the deep snow was painful, especially with an injured back, but fear gave him strength. Mike fell several times, got back up, and kept running. The sounds of destruction gradually faded behind him, but he didn't stop until he saw the silhouette of his pickup truck ahead. The fallen tree was still blocking the road, but Mike found a spot where he could drive around the obstacle along the shoulder. The pickup got stuck in the snow a few times, but the four-wheel drive helped it get out. The main thing was to get as far away from that place as possible. He arrived at the park headquarters around 2 a.m. and immediately reported what had happened to his boss, Dan Coleman. He said that he had been attacked by an unknown animal, possibly an unusually large bear, and also mentioned the damage caused to the campground and the need for an investigation. As far as I know, a group of rangers and wildlife protection officials arrived at the campground. What they discovered was simply unbelievable. The office building was completely destroyed. The roof had collapsed, the walls were shattered, and equipment was scattered all over the premises. The tracks led from the ruined building into the forest, but after half a mile they disappeared on a rocky slope. The remains of Mike's radio were found, plastic debris and a bent antenna, and his flashlight was discovered 40 yards from the campsite, crushed flat like a tin can. The official report stated that a bear had attacked the camp. Such incidents were rare, but they did occur. A bear that had not gone into hibernation could behave aggressively and unpredictably. Mike was given a medical certificate for a work-related injury and granted time off to recover. But Mike himself knew the truth, and that truth wouldn't let him rest.